Did you know that a strategic error by Red Bull in Barcelona put Max Verstappen on the brink of suspension from F1? What seemed like just a bad day on track could be a sign of something much more serious brewing within the team. Before we continue, tell me in the comments, do you think Red Bull is losing control this season? What really happened between Verstappen and Russell that could change the course of the 2025 championship? In this video, we'll break down what exactly went wrong for Red Bull during the 2025 Spanish GP, from tire decisions to the controversial crash between Verstappen and Russell, and what this reveals about the current state of the team. To understand the chaos Red Bull experienced at the 2025 Spanish Grand Prix, we must start with something many overlooked. The team arrived at Montmello with a technical uncertainty that had been dragging on from previous races. Although from the outside it seemed they were maintaining dominance, internally the situation was more fragile than previously thought. The team implemented several aerodynamic updates, focusing primarily on the front wing and diffuser with the aim of gaining downforce in fast corners. At first glance, it seemed a logical step, but Formula One is unforgiving of imbalances, and these improvements, instead of stabilizing the car, ended up accentuating one of Red Bull's biggest problems all season: tire degradation. The RB21 showed inconsistent performance on long runs from the first free practice sessions. The simulations revealed a worrying fact. After 15 laps, the car was losing up to 0.4 seconds per lap compared to Lando Norris's McLaren. That difference, on a circuit where sustained pace is everything, cannot be hidden with talent or an aggressive strategy. Why was this happening? Because Red Bull was prioritizing a car with more aggressive aerodynamic balance in qualifying, capable of extracting everything in a single lap, but unable to sustain that performance at race pace. The result was a car that was fast in clean conditions, but unstable and greedy on the compounds when the race demanded consistency. Added to this was another obstacle. The new technical directive known as TD018 focused on limiting flexible wings. This regulation was particularly tough for Red Bull. The team had to modify the rear wing design to comply with the new stiffness levels required by the FIA. Although these modifications are not visible to the human eye, the effects on the track are profound. The immediate consequence was a loss of efficiency on the straights and a greater challenge in finding the right balance through transition corners, such as turns 3, 4, and 5 at the Barcelona circuit. In other words, Red Bull had to rethink the entire aerodynamic package at a critical moment in the championship, and this, of course, directly affected the performance of Verstappen's car. Meanwhile, rivals, especially McLaren, continued to exploit their race consistency. Lando Norris, with a balanced MCL39 that was less demanding on the tires, cemented his position as a real title contender. Red Bull, on the other hand, was beginning to show signs of cracks. The pressure was mounting, not only from outside, but also from within the garage itself. As Red Bull entered the Spanish Grand Prix weekend with these technical concerns about the RB21's performance, rumors also began to emerge pointing to growing tension within the team. What was once a solid, efficient, and quietly dominant structure began to show signs of wear. And it wasn't just about on-track performance issues. In the paddock, conversations among journalists, engineers, and analysts began to revolve around a disturbing topic. Max Verstappen no longer seemed as aligned with the decisions from the pit wall as he had been in previous seasons. His radio messages during the race were not only critical, but visibly laced with frustration, something we had rarely seen from the Dutch driver when he blindly trusted the team's strategic judgment. One of the biggest points of contention arose around the management of the new regulations, particularly the aforementioned technical directive TD018. Although Red Bull officially downplayed the impact of this new regulation, internal sources indicate that the adjustments required by the FIA had a greater impact than the team cares to admit. Modifying the rear wing to meet stiffness standards required a rethink of the car's entire aerodynamic flow. Christian Horner publicly defended the idea that the team adapted without compromising its competitiveness, but the on-track results told a different story. Privately, there was talk of a car that had lost part of its DNA. It was no longer dominant at top speed, nor balanced in fast corners, and this double loss began to cause concern. This technical tension led to strategic mistrust. During pre-race meetings, some team members reportedly questioned the aggressiveness of the three-stop approach, something unusual at Montmello. However, management insisted, relying on simulation data and the assumed pace they could maintain on the soft compound. Max, according to several sources close to him, was not completely convinced, but agreed to follow the plan. And this is where the pieces of the puzzle begin to align. It wasn't just a poorly executed strategy, but a driver who was already feeling that the technical and sporting decisions weren't designed to maximize his strengths, but rather to justify the team's risky bets. All of this creates a pressure-filled environment. A car that no longer performs as it once did, a technical directive that requires a redesign of key aspects of the car, a strategy questioned even from within, and a driver who is beginning to show discomfort. In these types of situations, what happens on the track is only the visible part of a deeper conflict. If there was one key moment that sealed Red Bull's fate at the 2025 Spanish Grand Prix, it was the tactical gamble the team made before the lights went out. At first glance, it seemed like a calculated move, opting for a three-stop strategy, something unconventional at a circuit like Montmello, where two-stop strategies historically predominate. But rather than representing a data-driven competitive advantage, that decision exposed a mismatch between the team's predictions and the reality on the track. The objective was clear: keep Verstappen in clean air as long as possible, taking advantage of the theoretical advantage of a soft tire, and then close the race with a long run using the hard compound. What they didn't anticipate was that each of those assumptions would fail, one after the other, leaving their star driver in a technically and psychologically compromised situation. The first big mistake was blindly trusting the soft tire's performance. In free practice, especially in FP2, it was observed that the C3 compound could sustain competitive pace for around 18 to 20 laps. However, these results were obtained under very specific conditions: no traffic, no direct pressure from immediate rivals, and with a fuel load optimized for simulation. In the race, the story was completely different. Constant traffic, overtaking attempts, and the thermal stress generated by a more abrasive track than expected deteriorated the compounds much faster than anticipated. Red Bull reacted late to this loss of performance, forcing Verstappen to modify his driving style and compromise his pace to conserve tires that were already below the competitive threshold. But without a doubt, the most controversial decision was the choice of the hard tire, C1, for the final stint. At a point in the race when Verstappen needed to recover positions and fight against drivers on softer compounds, Red Bull opted to give him the most durable tire, but also the slowest and least maneuverable of the weekend. The subsequent statements by Simone Barra, Pirelli's chief engineer, were devastating. The C1 generated understeer in slow corners and oversteer in fast corners, a combination that made aggressive driving virtually impossible. Despite this warning, the team relied on the compound's durability to compensate for its lack of pace. This assumption not only proved wrong, but also exposed Verstappen to multiple traffic situations, as he had to overtake up to 4 cars on the track after each stop, further wearing down tires that already offered limited performance. Telemetry confirmed the disaster. Between laps 48 and 52, just as Verstappen had to push hard to make up ground, his pace dropped 0.8% against Lando Norris. In other words, while his main rival was advancing, Max stalled. The most worrying thing is that this drop was not the result of driving errors, but of excessive wear and a lack of traction resulting from the chosen tire. Each overtaking attempt required additional effort, both physical and mental. The frustration was evident in the radio communications: constant questions about tire choice, harsh comments about degradation, and a clear sense of helplessness. Ultimately, what Red Bull was trying to do was compensate for a technical deficit with an aggressive tactical maneuver. But the risk wasn't based on a realistic reading of the race conditions, but on an excessive faith in the simulation data. The problem was that the numbers didn't reflect the complexity of the real situation: a car that had already lost aerodynamic balance, a driver under pressure from his accumulation of penalties, and a race environment marked by constant traffic and rivals with better sustained pace. The result was a scenario in which Verstappen was forced to squeeze the most out of a poorly fitted car in adverse conditions, and with a strategy that left him exposed. The most disturbing thing is that these types of errors aren't isolated, but are beginning to form a pattern. In past seasons, Red Bull was known for executing almost surgical plans, with a tactical precision that disarmed its rivals. Now, However, strategic decisions seem to be driven more by instinct than cold analysis, and that comes at a high price in a championship as tight as the 2025 championship. What was supposed to be a plan to regain control of the race ended up being the turning point that unleashed chaos. And it was precisely in this context of frustration, exhaustion, and desperation that the most talked-about incident of the weekend unfolded. The most critical moment of the 2025 Spanish Grand Prix wasn't a miscalculated pit stop or out-of-control tire degradation. It was the exact moment when Max Verstappen, already frustrated and worn, came into contact with George Russell, triggering an incident that completely changed the narrative of the race and, arguably, the season. To understand the weight of that maneuver, we must look far beyond the impact itself. What happened wasn't a product of chance or an isolated error, but the inevitable outcome of a sequence of accumulated tensions, poor decisions, and pressure that had been building since the first lap. It all started after the safety car came out on lap 57. The field was compressed, margins were minimal, and decisions were being made in fractions of a second. Verstappen found himself in a difficult position. On freshly fitted hard tires, clearly less competitive than the used soft tires that both Russell and Leclerc were using. The Dutchman knew his only chance was to defend aggressively through the first corner and take advantage of any distraction from the Mercedes to gain some space. However, the uneven performance between the tires worked against him from the outset. At turn 1, Russell went for the outside and Max was forced slightly off the track, a maneuver that put him in an even more compromised position heading into the next section of the circuit. But it was at turn 5 that everything came to a head. According to telemetry data, Verstappen had been ordered to give up the position, likely in an attempt by the team to avoid additional penalties or risky situations. By letting Russell pass, Max was expected to do so cautiously, maintaining a safe line. However, what happened was exactly the opposite. As soon as the Mercedes passed, Verstappen applied sudden acceleration, going from 18% to 95% throttle pressure in just 0.3 seconds. This drastic change, made right in Russell's blind spot, caused an immediate loss of traction for the RB21. The result was lateral contact that destabilized both drivers and triggered a wave of real-time reactions. From the outside, it seemed like an impulsive action, but a deeper analysis reveals that it wasn't simply a miscalculation. Max didn't make that move out of clumsiness. He did it under a very high level of internal pressure, pressed to recover positions, irritated by the imposed strategy, and knowing that every lap he passed without overtaking further compromised his chances of scoring valuable points. And one fundamental detail cannot be overlooked. Verstappen arrived in Barcelona with 11 accumulated penalty points, just one short of the threshold that triggers a race suspension. This meant that any risky maneuver not only jeopardized his immediate result, but also jeopardized his continued championship standing. The tension was evident even in his radio communications. In one of the most blunt messages of the day, he was heard saying, "Why the hell are we on this tire?" A phrase that not only expressed his dissatisfaction with the strategy, but also revealed an emotional state on the verge of collapse. McLaren team principal Andrea Stella explained it very precisely after the race. When inadequate tires, pent-up frustration, and the need to recover positions at all costs combine, it creates what he called the perfect storm. And that's exactly what happened. The incident with Russell, far from being an isolated incident, was the clearest manifestation of the deteriorating relationship between the driver and his team that weekend. It also marked a change in the paddock's perception of Red Bull. For years, they were considered a relentless team, capable of maintaining a cool head in the most critical moments. But in Barcelona, what was seen was disarray, a lack of effective communication, and a driver who, for the first time in a long time, acted as if he were on his own. This collision, beyond the physical contact between two cars, represented a symbolic clash between the expectation of success and the harsh reality of a structure that is beginning to show cracks. From that moment on, the Grand Prix ceased to be a simple, complicated race and became a warning for Red Bull. And it wasn't the only one. Subsequent statements from both Verstappen and the team made it even clearer that this episode wouldn't be resolved with a simple apology. What happened in Barcelona can't be reduced to a bad weekend. It's a structural warning. The incident between Verstappen and Russell was just the most visible outcome of a series of cumulative failures that not only affect the team's performance, but also call into question its operating model. And this has far broader implications than the points lost in a single Grand Prix. Red Bull is facing, perhaps for the first time since its dominant era, a true crossroads. Continue to rely on a strategic aggression that brought them titles in the past, but now seems poorly calibrated, or restructure its processes to adapt to an F1 that is changing at a relentless speed. In the hours following the race, the statements from the protagonists reflected the internal unrest. Max Verstappen, who initially appeared evasive and even disinterested when asked about contact with Russell, ended up acknowledging hours later, uncharacteristically, that frustration over the strategy led him to an incorrect reaction. This is unusual for him. We're talking about a driver who rarely publicly acknowledges the team's tactical errors. His comment was a clear sign that something isn't working inside the garage. When a world champion begins to distance himself from the technical decisions that directly affect him on the track, it's because trust, that invisible but essential element, is weakening. For his part, Christian Horner tried to contain the damage with ambiguous statements. He justified the choice of a hard tire as a commitment to durability in the face of the uncertainty of the soft compound, but he couldn't hide his annoyance with Pirelli dropping veiled criticisms about the C1's lack of competitiveness. This lukewarm defense, more focused on justifying what had already gone wrong than on taking responsibility, didn't convince either the team's inner circle or the paddock analysts. When the discourse begins to shift from technical analysis to external finger-pointing, it's a clear sign that internal solutions are scarce. Faced with this situation, Red Bull has no choice but to react. In fact, details of a new aerodynamic package that will be introduced at the Canadian Grand Prix have already been leaked. It includes a redesigned floor and a revised rear suspension that should improve load transfer under hard braking, an area where the RB21 has been showing weaknesses. Simulations are promising. There is talk of a 5% improvement in tire wear efficiency on more mechanically demanding circuits. However, these technical improvements will only be effective if accompanied by a thorough review of the way each strategic decision is made. It is no longer enough to have Adrian Newey fine-tuning the aerodynamics. More sober tactical management is now needed, more in tune with the current reality of the grid. And here another factor comes into play. TD018, the directive limiting flexible wings, continues to be a major obstacle for Red Bull. Although they have publicly denied that this was a determining factor in Barcelona, the most widely held technical opinion is that it has significantly affected them. James Allison, from Mercedes, was blunt. The teams that built their aerodynamic advantages on the basis of structural flexibility are the ones that will suffer the most in this new era. And although Red Bull strives to project a sense of normalcy, the on-track data suggests otherwise. The fast corners, where they once dominated, are now exposing them. The loss of efficiency has forced them to modify the way they design their weekends and, by extension, their race strategies. Red Bull's real challenge will not only be technical, it will be psychological. They will have to find a way to reconnect with their star driver, regain internal coherence, and establish a new balance between innovation and pragmatism. Because if one thing was clear in Barcelona, it's that the margin for error no longer exists. McLaren has found a stable combination of speed and consistency, Ferrari remains in the fight, and Mercedes is on the rise. There is no longer room for risky bets disguised as audacity. What comes next will be decisive. The next 2 or 3 races will be the true thermometer of whether what happened at Montmello was an isolated strategic accident or the beginning of a decline in the technical credibility of a team that, until recently, seemed invincible. And the most disturbing thing of all is that, for the first time in years, no one in the paddock dares to say that Verstappen and Red Bull are aligned for the immediate future. What happened at the 2025 Spanish Grand Prix was much more than a strategic error or a failed maneuver. It was a clear demonstration that even the most dominant teams can lose their way when pressure mounts, decisions don't align, and internal confidence begins to erode. Red Bull, which until recently was synonymous with absolute control, showed a vulnerability that even its most optimistic rivals didn't expect to see so soon. The combination of an unbalanced car, a risky strategy, and a driver who no longer feels fully supported exposed cracks that could widen if not corrected immediately. Max Verstappen's situation is a true reflection of all this. It's not just a passing frustration, but a growing discomfort that is perceptible in both his body language and his statements. The Max we saw in Barcelona was not the same one who firmly dominated the championship in previous years. He was a driver battling not only against his rivals, but also against his own team, against a strategy he didn't share, and against regulations that limited his main tool, a reliable, predictable, and winning car. The fact that he has finally acknowledged some of his responsibility doesn't diminish what he said between the lines, that the decisions affecting him aren't the right ones. On the other hand, Red Bull will have to decide soon which path to take. Persist in a strategic aggression that no longer suits current conditions, or recalibrate its approach to regain the solidity that made them champions. Technical updates can help, but without clear direction from the pit and a strengthened relationship with their star driver, no aerodynamic improvements will suffice. The rest of the field is on the lookout. McLaren, with an increasingly well-rounded project, and Ferrari, with its ambition intact, have already shown they can punish any mistake from the leaders. If Red Bull doesn't react, it could not only lose races, it could lose its winning identity. In short, what seemed like a simple racing error ended up revealing a silent crisis that is now in full view. The uncertainty surrounding Verstappen, the team's strategic fragility, and the effects of the regulatory changes create a scenario of maximum tension heading into the upcoming races. Nothing is certain, and for the first time in years, Red Bull no longer seems invulnerable. Let me know your opinion in the comments. Do you think Verstappen should continue to rely on Red Bull, or are we seeing the beginning of an inevitable distancing? And if you don't want to miss our exclusive analysis of what's coming up in the championship, subscribe now and activate your notifications. Intense weeks are coming, and we'll cover them in full detail here.